Hello everyone, this is Basileus, episode 6 of our series on why on earth Battlefield 1 looks so good and runs so well, especially compared to modern titles. So in this episode, as previously mentioned, we are going to examine what else? Lumen, everyone's favorite these days. So by this point in the series, we've spent a lot of time talking about why Battlefield 1 still looks so remarkable today. We've explored how DICE used photogrammetry to capture the subtle imperfections of real-world materials instead of relying solely on artists to recreate them by hand. We've looked at how Frostbite combined those assets with carefully authored lighting, allowing the game to produce scenes that still hold up nearly a decade later. And in the last episode, we also began pulling back the curtain on what happened after Battlefield 1 when the industry started moving away from that philosophy and toward worlds that were lit dynamically instead. But that leaves us with a much bigger question. If Battlefield 1 could look this good while running this well, why did the industry move on at all? Why would developers willingly abandon a workflow capable of producing incredibly stable images, excellent performance, and some of the most convincing environments ever put into a multiplayer shooter? First glance, it almost feels like something doesn't add up, right? Hardware has become dramatically faster since 2016. GPUs have grown more powerful with every generation. And yet, if you look at many modern AAA games, they often demand reconstruction techniques, aggressive upscaling, and significantly more processing power just to achieve the same frame rate that Battlefield 1 reached years ago at native resolution. It's tempting to look at that trend and conclude that the industry simply made the wrong decision. But that's not really what happened. In fact, by the end of this episode, I hope you'll come away with almost the opposite conclusion. Not that fake lighting was outdated, but that dynamic lighting is objectively better. But that once games began chasing a different kind of world, something like Lumen stopped being an ambitious experiment and started becoming almost inevitable. Because here's the thing, Battlefield 1 isn't just a beautiful game, it's an incredibly controlled one. And I don't mean controlled in the sense that the gameplay is scripted or restrictive. Battlefield matches are famously chaotic. Buildings collapse, artillery tears apart the landscape, and no two rounds ever play out quite the same way. The control exists somewhere much deeper. It's in the world itself. Let's go back to Ballroom Blitz. We visited that map several times already throughout this documentary, and every time we return to it, we've uncovered another layer of why it works so well. The first time we looked at it, we focused on the materials. The polished wood, the marble floors, the detailed plaster walls, the ornate furniture. Much of that realism came from photogrammetry and careful art direction. Later, we came back to talk about lighting. Those elegant interiors weren't simply textured well, they were illuminated by light that had been painstakingly prepared during development. Instead of asking your PC to calculate every bounce of light while you played, much of that work had already been solved ahead of time. Now we're returning to Ballroom Blitz again, but this time we're asking a different question. What assumptions did those decisions depend on? Because every optimization, every shortcut, and every clever trick in computer graphics is built on an assumption. If that assumption stays true, the shortcut works beautifully. If it disappears, the shortcut disappears with it. Now imagine walking into one of Ballroom Blitz's grand hallways. Sunlight streams through the tall windows, spilling across the floor before softly illuminating the opposite wall. The ceiling glows with warm, reflected light. The corners of the room naturally fall into shadow, and everything feels grounded because the lighting is consistent from one frame to the next. It feels effortless. But it only feels effortless because almost all of the difficult work happened months before the game ever shipped. During development, the artists knew where these windows would be. They knew what time of day the map represented. They knew which walls would receive sunlight. They knew where indirect light would bounce. They knew how bright the chandeliers should appear. Most importantly, they knew those answers weren't going to change. The last point is easy to overlook because it's so fundamental. The renderer isn't constantly asking, how should this room be lit? It already knows. So when you load into Ballroom Blitz, your graphics card isn't solving an enormous lighting puzzle from scratch every frame. It's reading answers that have already been prepared. That's one of the biggest reasons Battlefield 1 produces such a stable image. Last episode, we spent quite a bit of time talking about certainty. Not certainty in the artistic sense, but certainty in the mathematical sense. The renderer begins every frame already confident about an enormous amount of information. It doesn't have to estimate where indirect light should go. It doesn't have to gradually refine an answer over several frames. It doesn't need to reconstruct large parts of the image from incomplete information because so many of the expensive questions have already been answered. Everything else builds on top of that stable foundation. That's why Battlefield 1 feels so clean. That's why it scales so well to high resolutions. And that's why, even today, people are often surprised by how modern it still looks. But there's a hidden price to that certainty. It's a price Battlefield 1 happily pays because it aligns perfectly with the kind of game DICE wanted to build. The problem is that the rest of the industry gradually stopped making games with those same assumptions. To understand why, let's leave Battlefield for a moment and think about something much simpler. Imagine you're designing your dream home. You spend months deciding where every window should go. You carefully choose the size of each room. You position the furniture exactly where you want it. Then, once construction is finished, you hire an interior designer to create the perfect lighting. They study how the afternoon sun enters the living room windows, through the living room windows. They adjust the color of the walls to complement that light. They place lamps in exactly the right positions. They create a space that feels warm in the evening and bright during the day. Everything works because nothing moves. The walls stay where they are. The windows never change position. The furniture remains exactly where it was designed to be. Now imagine someone walks in with a sledgehammer. They knock out an entire wall. Suddenly the afternoon sun pours into rooms that were never meant to receive direct light. The shadows across the floor disappear. The reflected light changes. The atmosphere changes. But though you haven't added a single new light source, almost every lighting decision in the house is now wrong. Nothing broke because the lighting system was bad. It broke because the world it was built for no longer exists. And that, more than anything else we've discussed so far, is the problem that modern rendering has spent the last decade trying to solve. Because developers weren't just adding prettier graphics after Battlefield 1. They were removing the assumptions that made Battlefield 1's graphics so efficient. That's a subtle distinction, but it's probably the most important idea in this entire episode. Battlefield 1 didn't succeed because baked lighting is universally superior. It succeeded because Frostbite was allowed to prepare answers in advance. Modern engines increasingly aren't. And once those answers can no longer be prepared ahead of time, the renderer has to start discovering them while you are playing. That's where the story of Lumen really begins. I hope everything ties up together nicely until now. I hope you continue to find this very interesting as I find it in researching it. By the way, I noticed that a couple of my episodes in Greek, the guide that I prepared in Greek for Blood on Crystal, had some users use subtitles. I think it was in Chinese and Arabic, something like that. I hope you find my content entertaining. I hope you speak English because I don't speak these languages. So, as a minimum, you won't need to translate this episode. And if you do enjoy this content, please make sure you subscribe because more episodes are coming up on this series specifically. It's turning out to be very interesting, for me at least, while I am researching it and writing the script. I am Basileus. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, leave a like, subscribe, comment freely. Everything helps. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.